a brief history of work. So this session here, hello.
Sorry. I'm sorry.
No, come and sit at the front.
Alright, thank you.
You don't have to thank me for sitting at the front. Remember there's a register somewhere. Where's the registers? Hello, registers? Okay, great. Right, organisations and business has a historical perspective. This is a talk. Better talk. Similar talk, okay. Right, thank you very much. Bye-bye. We are all here for 119, Sam, aren't we? Yeah, you're not doing physics or anything, or microbiology. Okay, I don't mind, this is interesting. Brief history of work. Because this is interesting, a brief history of work. Historically speaking, work is a relatively new concept. That's one of the interesting things that we find about this kind of area, that a lot of what we think of as being standard and has been for always is relatively new. So the moral value in doing a good job, which is embedded in what we do today, is relatively new. Working hard is a relatively new concept. Historically speaking, into antiquity, work was not something that most people aspired to. Most people aspired to leisure. Wouldn't that be great? Most people aspired to leisure. There were the leisure class and there were slaves. That was the distinction, really. So it wasn't until later on, relatively recently, hundreds of years ago, that physical labour became culturally acceptable. So work originally was seen as a kind of curse. The Greek word for work means sorrow. So the purpose, according to the Greeks, the Romans, and cultures of antiquity, was that the purpose of man was to develop culture, art, philosophy, politics, study, discourse, rhetoric, debates. For the Romans, work was things that the slaves did. It was only with the Protestant Reformation that this kind of idea came about, that people should work for a living. And Max Weber, who I mentioned before, 1905, try and think of people's names with dates after them. So Weber, 1905, who wrote about the Protestant work ethic. So diligence, punctuality, looking for salaries at the end of the month or bonuses at the end of the year, all became new things. Over a period of time, over hundreds of years, the idea that work is the thing that we do moved away from being a religious activity into just part of everyday culture. And we no longer expect to have a leisure life, we have a weekend. The concept of having a week and a weekend is relatively new, just as the concept of having a holiday is relatively new. This module looks at the theoretical means by which businesses and organisations can be described. It reviews how the models have changed over time in recognition of the changes that have taken place in business and our understanding of business over time. And it's supplemented by a series of case studies, some of which I've mentioned before that I'll be introducing, and some of which you'll be introducing. The big changes, of course, in the 20th century, the late part of the 20th century, has been this explosion in the use of knowledge. Prior to this stage, it was all manufacturing. And of course, we don't do much manufacturing now, particularly in this country. Our abilities are geared around knowledge and services. And for us as a country, and for businesses in this country, knowledge is the new product. It used to be the fact that we could crank out large numbers of machines or aircraft or engines. We don't do that anymore. We subcontract that to other people. We come up with the ideas. And the knowledge society, the society that you're part of, will inform your future careers as you move on. The knowledge society requires different kinds of organisations and businesses. So we'll see when we look at the models and theories how organisations and businesses have changed over time. Part of this discussion today is to look at how this set of models and theories will inform you about your future career. What we're going to have is, subject to confirmation by yourselves, is every now and then we'll have a little ad break. Okay, so just chat amongst yourselves. So every half an hour, 20 minutes or so, we'll just have a chat. Right, so let's look at the future of work. So remember we were talking about organising and businesses. We've talked about the fact that people have been thinking about the theory and models supporting organising businesses for some considerable amount of time. We've talked about the idea that organisations themselves are relatively new. Business as an academic product is relatively new. The idea of work itself is relatively new. Let's talk about how organisations need to change in the future. And there's a whole variety of viewpoints about what the future might be, but they all start generally from consistent viewpoints. So this is one viewpoint by a professor down at in a university in London from 2010. So already it's a little bit out of date. So what she is saying is that you and your career is not based necessarily only on things that have gone on before. What's happening now is a profound series of changes. If I talk about, for instance, what I was experiencing when I was your age and slightly before, I didn't have a calculator. There weren't things like mobile phones, of course, but there weren't things like, and I'm not old, okay, despite what you might be thinking, I'm not that old. When I started working in the IT industry. One of my jobs, my job was in sales and marketing. I worked for a company called Sperry Univac, and Sperry Univac were working with Shell Oil at that time to introduce the first commercial laser printer to this country, and I sold for Sperry Univac the first commercial laser printers. £250,000 that was in 1979. It was huge. We sold mainframe computers. They didn't have PCs at that time. They didn't have little computers. We sold big computers, £1 million plus. £1 million. £1 million plus. A lot of money. And the computers were so big they would fill this room. In the course of one generation, the whole means by which we communicate and access information has changed fundamentally. And that will only continue. So we have to think about, based upon in part what's gone on before, which it helps us understand what might happen in the future, we have to work out what's going to happen in the future. There'll be many more people in the future. People generally will be richer. Average wealth will have dramatically increased. You might have heard on the news today the news that by next year the top 1% of the world's population will own as much as the rest of the world combined, which is a huge disparity. But for most people are getting richer. Most people are living longer. Most people are having more comfortable lives. And even in the environments where they're not getting richer or living longer or having comfortable lives, that will change over a period of time. So our world, which we kind of think of being as America and Europe and maybe Japan, will become all-embracing. So there are three questions that we have to ask ourselves when we're thinking about the organisations of the future. What's going to change and shape the organisations of the future? What are the forces that are going to impact upon them? How best can we learn ways, based upon theoretical models, of future-proofing our organisation for the future? and what steps do we need to make sure that we focus our attention and our resources on where it's needed. There are 5 external factors affecting organisations and businesses into the future and therefore affecting your own careers. The 5 factors are technological developments, globalisation, changes in demographics, changes in society, and low carbon developments. Remember, this is one person's viewpoint. This is not the law. This is not how it is going to be. This is just one person's viewpoint. They're similar viewpoints, but not all the same. By 2025, given that this was written in 2010, 5 billion people will be connected by mobile devices. The cloud, which we're all aware of now but weren't really sure of in 2010, will deliver low-cost computing. So the cloud is already changing the way that we download information. We no longer need to buy DVDs of software. We can download the information. We don't have to own it. We can rent it. These are all big changes. There'll be an increasing amount of work performed by robots. There'll be an increasing number of people creating content. So whereas before we had people who created content who might be called authors, and we had these entities which we might call publishers, that's going to change now. We've already started to see this in terms of wikis and the development of Wikipedia. We'll also be seeing computers which are increasingly capable of learning and creating content themselves. We are increasingly able to develop sophisticated artificial intelligences. Now that offers all sorts of interesting dilemmas about what we do, what you do, because it's your career. Because potentially we're starting to see now the difference between work and leisure, or different types of work. Historically, of course, we've all been doing the same kind of work. Some people were more senior than others, and generally speaking, people work their way up to the top from the bottom. But that needn't be the case nowadays. Globalisation. Globalisation is something that we talked about before. So the second factor affecting your career in the future is the fact that you are now globalised individuals. You might not feel like it. You might feel here in Coventry. But actually, by the time you start your career and have developed your career, you'll be part of a worldwide global economy. Because we're already seeing the development of the BRIC nations, that's Brazil, Russia, India and China, thank you. Someone from Russia over there, I hope. Brazil, Russia, India and China. The next wave operations, countries, Egypt, Nigeria and Turkey, will also be coming through. So these economies add their own values to the world's wealth. We'll also see people moving to cities. So there's been a discussion, hasn't there, about should people be living in the country? Historically, we all lived in the country. The cities were very small. Over a period of time, due to scale of economies, people moved to the cities. The country is now depleted. Now we're seeing increasingly people moving to the southeast in this country. Increasingly, we're seeing London being the southeast. Increasingly, we're seeing London moving up to the Midlands. That's why we're having this kind of regional sense of we want autonomy for the north, we want a Midlands environment, because otherwise we will just be part of London. This will be London. So these are mega cities, and there are mega cities around the world, and we can see those developing. We talked about the knowledge economy before, and knowledge workers. We talked about, just previously, the development of the interconnected global environment. Well, the smart people around the world will be connected. We'll be connected in terms of labour, we'll be connected in terms of products and services, we'll be connected in terms of jobs. Whereas historically, 100 and something years before, if you were born in Coventry, you worked in Coventry, and you died in Coventry, now that isn't the case at all. You might still be in a location physically, but you can be working anywhere around the world. The third change then is the demographic change. This is a big change. So baby boomers, have you come across the term baby boomers? Baby boomers means a generation. Yeah, so it's the post-war. It's the generation that came post-war. The term comes from America, and there was a boom in babies because all the servicemen were coming back from the war. And it's that generation which has fueled this huge increase in changes in the way we work and the changes the way we live in the West, at least. By 2025, they'll have left the workforce, taking with them most of the money. And your generation is left with that difficulty of developing your own expertise and developing wealth of your own, coupled with the fact that people will increasingly be living longer. Not only are you having to work longer, you'll be living longer. So this calls into question all sorts of assumptions about, for instance, how we work, how long we work, what kind of career we have. So, talking about myself again, as I like to do so much, my dad's generation was the generation, my dad's generation, so your grandparents' generation, I guess, was the generation who, generally speaking, had a job for life. They went to school, hardly anybody went to university, they came out of school, they might have had some training and an apprenticeship, and they were in a company in that location, generally for life. My generation was the first that started to have a career which required changing. But we still had one career. It wasn't that you had one job or one employer, but you had a career. That is unlikely to be the case for you. You're going to have several careers, and you might have a period of time when you aren't working at all, not through any maternal or paternal leave, just because you decided, I've had enough. If you're living a long time, healthily living a long time, you can afford to take breaks. Now this means, again, these things combined together mean that there are significant changes in the way that we organise ourselves, organise our businesses, and undertake commerce. So added to all of these, we can see that there's been a decline in trust between leadership, business leaders and politicians amongst the public. People will become much more individualistic. Whereas before, in my father's generation, you were company people, you worked for the company, you stayed in the company, you retired from the company, they gave you a gold watch when you left. Nowadays, it's your choice as to what you want to do, how you want to achieve your career goals, whatever those career goals might be. You might work from home, you might work in small community hubs, you might take time off, you might change your career. Doesn't really matter. This is entirely up to you. Increasingly, people will become what are called neo-nomads or freelancers. So we no longer see people tied to a company for life. We see people negotiating individual contracts that suit their requirements at that moment in time. And as another aspect, the fifth aspect this author was looking at in terms of vision of the future was that the way that we undertake energy will also change, and we know most of this now. So although it says oil prices will rise substantially, at this specific moment in time, of course, we know that oil prices are reducing. But that's a short-term blip. Presumably, we assume, so that Saudi Arabia can wreck the American shale gas economy and increase prices in oil again. That's the assumption. These three things are not individual, they are not separate. They work together to produce a completely different environment for you, your career, organisations that you're building, organisations that you're working for in the future. How does this affect you and your career then? What you have to do is you have to gain expertise. Whereas before it was about numbers of people, today it's about expertise. It's being able to develop expertise in particular areas. It's about networking. It's about being able to evidence different types of expertise softer skills, what are called soft skills rather than hard skills, and building a coherent mass of people around the world with whom you'll be working. The difficulty for yourselves is because you're an individual, seen as an individual, but as part of a crowd, the trick will be, who do you network with? Who do you operate with? Which countries do you operate in? Because you can't do all of this, whatever it is required, you can't do all of this on your own. You have to be networked with people. Now, behind all of this, of course, there are companies and organisations, and they are having to cope with these changes. And so therefore these organisations are having to come up with new ways of working. So you might have seen just before Christmas, Richard Branson announced the fact that his head office staff can take as much holiday as they like. Whereas before you had a day off a year, 100 years ago, 150 years ago. Now at Richard Branson's head office, you can have as much holiday as you like. If you feel you're doing the job well enough, take some time off. Doesn't matter how long. The assumption behind that is that there's a level of trust. We trust you, the individual, we, the organisation, trust you, the individual, that you will balance your needs and our needs. And we trust you to do that. So you need to think about your type of lifestyle, because maximising wealth will not be the key aim as it has been for the last 2 generations. Buying the car, buying the house. Many people can't afford houses now. Many people will not afford houses into the future, and many people will not wish to own a house. They may have a more nomadic lifestyle. These are all difficult choices for you to make. So the emphasis will be on regeneration. It'll be about well-being. And these are all things also that companies are introducing. There are impacts on organisations. What organisations will be looking for, particularly in the future, are, again, 5 particular facets. Remember, we're talking about one person's view of the future. 5 facets. This term, authentic, is new. People are looking for authentic employees, authentic leaders. They're looking for high-performing virtual teams. They're looking for valuable networks. They're looking for valuable relationships and offering flexible working. So authenticity. This is a term that I've only come across over the last 3 or 4 years. What it means is we're employing you as you. We like you. When you come to work, be you. What we'll find when we talk about motivation and decision making and things like that and team building is that there's a difference between the you in social life and the you at work. And what companies are saying is, we don't want the you at work, we want the you that we like to be at work, so that we don't have conflict, so that we can be clear about decisions. Leaders will be part of a team, rather than being this person that you don't see very often. Leaders will be part of a team. Virtual teams, crossing boundaries, crossing countries, crossing time zones, working virtually, never usually meeting. Relationships become very important. Increasingly, companies will value and be valued by the wealth of their networks. Historically, again, 150 years ago, companies were valued by their assets, by the physical value of the things they owned. In the last 50 years or so, companies have been valued by their knowledge, by their intellectual property, by their patents and things like that. Increasingly in the future, companies will be valued by who they know. Value is created outside the organisation, for instance, by the organisation's relationships with the local community and with the international community. And increasingly, we've seen over the last 20 or so years, but increasingly over the last 5 years, this concept called corporate social responsibility. That's relatively new. The idea that a company has a social responsibility. And like most things in academic world and in organisations, that's not a view that's universally held. There is an argument that says actually companies shouldn't be corporately socially responsible. And finally, flexible working. Flexibility, a growing competence for companies, meeting the demands of individuals, members of staff, as well as the demands of a company operating throughout the world in different time zones. So that's Linda Grattan, Professor of Management Practice at London Business School, published in 2010. So that's one viewpoint about the future, but it is similar in many ways to other people's viewpoints of the future. The reason we're talking about this is because this module is Organising for Business. Organisations and organisational structures and theories and businesses are not static. They have changed enormously over a period of time and are changing at this moment in time and will be changing increasingly in the future. The case studies that we'll be looking at, particularly group companies like Amazon and Supergroup or Superdry, show just how things have changed in a relatively recent period of time. Okay, we don't have time for an ad break, but you can have a little break and chat amongst yourselves. Person in the white, at the back, this is it. Okay? Go for it. Where's the register? 2 registers. Where are the registers? One there? Okay, great. Another one over here somewhere? Super. Has everybody filled in the register? No, you didn't, did you? No. Okay, I'll come and get the register. Yeah, so the registers, if you could, I'm obsessed with the registers. I'm rubbish with the registers. When you're finished, can you send the registers down the front, please? Okay, jobs of the future. This was interesting, looking at this. So these are jobs that people came up with in 2011 that will be in existence in 2030, that don't exist now. That's a very on the Moodle website are 2 documents related to jobs. One is careers in top companies, times 100 case studies, companies who've got jobs available. They're giving details there. And then there's another document, which is where this has come from, looking at jobs in the 2030 and where that information has come from, where that thought process has come from. Someone made up avatar relationship manager. But once you start to make things up, then they start to become real and can be created. So I did read somewhere, I haven't been able to track it down, but most of the jobs that you'll have in your career, once you're starting into your mid-career, don't actually exist at the moment. So it's an exciting future that you have in front of you. So, I don't know. I don't know what I was thinking. Okay, let's get on to basics then. So there'll be a quiz on this in the seminar next week. Yeah, I know. It's all go, isn't it? Eh? So what is an organisation? What is an organisation? Well, some people describe it as a social arrangement for achieving controlled performance in pursuit of collective goals. Controlled performance means setting standards, measuring performance, comparing actual with standard, and taking corrective action if necessary. So I said at the beginning, this is an odd module title, Organising for Business. because to a certain extent we're assuming that organisation and business are the same. So if we talk about organisation, we actually mean business. What do all organisations have in common? People, objectives, structure, and a form of management. So that's how we're describing an organisation. It's a group of people working together with an agreed set of objectives within some form of structure where there is a management operation delegating to a performing operation. Or put it another way, we have an operation which has a collective purpose, a defined and grouped set of tasks, stable structured relationships, and clear boundaries. Now what's interesting about this is looking back at how organisations have been. From what the discussion has been so far about what the future might look like, this isn't actually what the organisations of the future might look like. And we can start to see that organisations of the future do exist already. Google would be a case study that we'll look at. Google is a really interesting form. Time's up. Bye then. Hold on. No, just joking. Sit down. Goodness me. Be still my beating heart. Here we are. Hey. Well done, computer system. Okay, so what do organisations do? They create... Okay, I know it's exciting. It's not that exciting though. They create products and services customers. Remember that the organisation's customer may not be the end customer. One of the things we look at during the course of this module is the supply chain. So there are different types of organisations. So this is really basic stuff. You should know this. This is kind of just to make sure that you know all this. There are different kinds of organisations, and we can talk about 3 generic types. Remember, there's a quiz on this next week. People at the back in the seminar. People at the back. Thank you. Okay, 3 types of organisations. Private enterprise organisations like Marks and Spencer's, public sector organisations like the National Health Sector, and not-for-profit organisations like Oxfam, and these are just examples. As always in life, in academic life, things aren't always that clear-cut. There are things which are in a grey area. So when we talk about Royal Bank of Scotland, for instance, is that a private enterprise organisation or a public sector organisation? Why would I be asking that question? Royal Bank of Scotland? Who owns the Royal Bank of Scotland? We do. That's right. So it's supposed to be a private sector organisation, but actually it's owned by us. Very little is completely clear-cut. And that's one of the interesting things. That's one of the things that I look for when I'm reading exam answers, for instance, is the ability for someone like yourselves to tease out some of these complexities. Because it's very easy to remember all of this stuff, because you're all bright people. It's very easy to remember all of this. So what I'm looking for is the ability to understand that things aren't that clear-cut. So private enterprise sector organisations are owned by groups of people or individuals acting in pursuit of private objectives, usually profit. Profit is used to be put back into the business, to develop new sectors, new organisations and so forth. So one of the differences then between the private enterprise organisation and the public sector organisation is that the public sector shouldn't really be dealing with profit. They have budgets and they have underspends or overspends. They don't deal with profit. So there are different types of private businesses. Remember, this is just basic stuff, just to make sure you know all this kind of basic stuff. Different types of private businesses: sole traders, owner-managers, partnerships and limited partnerships, private limited companies, and public limited companies, PLCs. Go quiet at the back, please. Quiet at the back. Okay, thank you. Public sector companies, providing services paid for out of taxes and other forms of revenues. Some examples of these then will be local and district councils, government departments, state schools, National Health Service or hospitals. Remember, these are all organisations and they are all in business. They all have structures, they all have needs, and they will all change into the future. So what happens if a public sector organisation makes a profit? Well, they can't. It's called a surplus. So they go back into developing new assets, building new schools, training staff, lowering council taxes, giving us rebates and so forth. Then there are not-for-profit organisations. Charities, religious organisations, trade associations, political parties and so forth. Now what's interesting about this, also from an organisational point of view, is how these have changed over time. So who goes to Oxfam? I buy books from Oxfam. There was a time when you could go into Oxfam and get books really cheaply, because they were just kind of giving them away. Person in the white t-shirt. It's all about you. Look, it's about me. This session's about me.
He's dealing with Starburst.
He's what?
Starburst.
There's a lot of energy going on over there. Okay. I understand why you're so hyper then. I can understand that. Have a bit of Red Bull and you'll be over the wall. Okay. Now the thing about Oxfam is Oxfam now is one of the world's largest booksellers. Which is odd, really, because that's not what Oxfam was originally set up for, and it's not what we think of Oxfam being. It's a little charity shop selling clothes that people have given to them. That's a massive business, making money. There's a dependence between the private sector and the public sector. And if you listen to the news, you'll know that this is an ongoing discussion, particularly related to the NHS, particularly related to things like the police, because there's an ongoing concern that organisations which are public sector organisations, like the NHS, like the police, are being privatised by being put out to the private sector, who are profit-oriented. So that means we have a police force potentially who are there being motivated by profit, which causes all sorts of concerns. Let's think about Coventry University. We spent a bit of time talking about Coventry University and its structure in the seminars. So Coventry University, it's a higher education corporation established under the Education Reform Act 1988, one of my favourite acts, by order of the Privy Council. Has a long history, 100 or so years. Started off as the School of Art in Coventry and then has developed over a period of time. It's an exempt charity. How would you describe Coventry University? What's your view as a business of Coventry University? Is it public sector or private sector? Public. Anybody think it's private sector? Nobody. Okay, that's interesting. We'll have a look at that in the seminars. Because Coventry University, like many organisations these days, is a hybrid organisation. It does have a profit motive. It does have an enterprise operation. It also has this public good value of education, which is what it's been about for a long period of time. So Coventry University is one of the things we start to look at this week, and then we move into the case studies, which I hope are more reflective of marketing, advertising, and the kind of things you're more likely to be interested in. That's it. Where are the registers?